Ike also talks about Bill Hayes, who was one of the men who helped build HAARP, but later learned about its supposed real purpose and started speaking out against it. He says pulsed radiation can cause neurological and physiological damage by interfering with natural body rhythms, standing wave frequencies, which are the body's information blueprint, and brainwave activity. Hayes describes how the atmosphere is being transformed into electrically charged plasma for military weather manipulation and surveillance with the potential to change DNA. So he says pulsed radiation can change DNA. And again, Alexandra said the same thing when talking about HAARP. She said radiation changes DNA.
Radiation changes DNA. This grid radiates sigils, or geometric designs, into the atmosphere that resonate like when a rock is thrown into a river and the water ripples around it.
Now, I want to hang on this idea for just a second, because this is another recurring theme in the conspiracy Great Awakening narrative. This idea that the elites are using radiation, vaccines, etc. to change our DNA in order to control us, whether it's to make us more reptilian, more robotic, more docile, whatever. It's an offshoot of the Nephilim hybrid bloodline narrative that the false light is obsessed with. They're consumed by the idea that the elites are trying to alter human DNA and that Satan and the demons are carrying out some massive genetic engineering program. For example, this New Age blog, The Portal, that we looked at earlier, referenced the genetic engineering of the archons. This obsession with genetic engineering is another false light trait. And the Christian side of this narrative stems from a grand extrapolation of Genesis 6, where angels interbred with women and created a hybrid offspring called the Nephilim. And they reason that Satan's grand plan has always been to disrupt the human genome, which teachers like Chuck Missler heavily promoted, and that Satan's still trying to carry out this plan today. And this is why the Nephilim have always been such a hot topic in the Christian truther community. For example, Skywatch TV has done many episodes on the Nephilim. Daniel chapter 2 is also mixed up in this, where Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the final kingdom of iron and clay. The popular view within the Christian conspiracy community has been that iron and clay is talking about some more mixing of angelic and human DNA, just like it happened in Genesis 6. So what they essentially do is superimpose Genesis 6 on top of Daniel 2. Christian truthers tend to see the end times through the Genesis 6 Nephilim paradigm and theorize that there will be this grand return of the Nephilim in the last days. And they also drag in Matthew 24:37 to bolster their case, where Jesus says that the coming of the Son of Man will be like the days of Noah, as in the Nephilim will be roaming the earth once again, just like they were in the days of Noah, which is why you'll see the phrase, the days of Noah, so common in the Christian truther scene. So be aware of anyone emphasizing that phrase too much. But I don't think Christ was saying that it would literally be like the days of Noah in every respect, with a massive Nephilim infestation. First of all, just looking at this big picture-wise, I think it's pretty clear that God wanted those things wiped out. So I think it would be silly to suggest that God would allow it to happen again on such a grand scale. And yes, the Nephilim did return briefly after the flood, as the Israelites reported on their way to the Promised Land. The land of Canaan was filled with them. And then, of course, we have Goliath and his brothers. But they didn't return nearly on the scale that they existed before the flood. I think by the time of David, they were almost completely gone, with the exception of a few like Goliath and his brothers. All Christ was saying about his return being like the days of Noah was that people will be completely caught off guard like they were by the flood. Jesus even says in verse 39, "And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." The only real parallel he was making between his return and the days of Noah was the lack of awareness about the massive destruction that was coming. As Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, the people will be crying peace and safety just before sudden destruction. The sudden destruction being Christ's return on the clouds and the pouring out of his wrath. So everyone will be completely unaware about what's coming. Just as the flood swept all the people away in the days of Noah, so the people will be swept away by Christ's return. He wasn't talking about some grand return of the Nephilim. And with regard to Daniel 2, I think the iron and clay of the final kingdom is simply referring to the beast and the harlot, because as Revelation 17 says, they are partnered or joined together for a time. But that union is very unstable and doesn't last long. As Daniel says of the iron and clay, that they are joined together in marriage but don't hold together. And at the end of Revelation 17, the beast throws off the harlot and destroys her. These are clearly parallel passages. I don't see how a hybrid mixing of DNA would be described as a marriage. That doesn't make any sense. Yes, it says in Genesis 6 that the angels took women in marriage, but that's just describing the literal act of marriage. It wasn't necessarily referring to the hybrid mixing specifically. So I don't think these passages are saying anything about a massive end times agenda to mix human and angelic DNA like it happened in Genesis 6, which guys like L.A. Marzulli and Skywatch TV, etc., also Gon Shamira from Face Like the Sun, have been promoting for quite a long time. And what they typically do with that is tie it in with the so-called alien deception, saying that these alien abductions, and in some cases impregnations that happen during these abductions, are part of Satan's grand plan to bring the Nephilim back and build his army to usher in the Antichrist. For instance, here's a video on Skywatch TV, the alien breeding program, how the UFO phenomenon is connected to the Nephilim. And then in the thumbnail it says, Satan is building an army. This is all Gnostic deception. So we see how all these different narratives tie together as part of one grand Gnostic narrative about the end times. Another way that the alien deception narrative is itself a deception. And an interesting fact about this is that many New Agers also push the return of the Nephilim narrative as well. David Icke, as I've recently discovered, discusses the Nephilim and Genesis 6 in the context of the New World Order agenda, because he, like the Christian truther community, sees it as relevant to their agenda. Here he is, for example, talking about Genesis 6 in one of his videos on Gaia TV from the series Escape the Matrix. Hopefully we'll be able to talk more about this later, because it ties in with the whole Illuminati bloodline narrative that the conspiracy movement believes in. But this correlates with guys like L.A. Marzulli being so-called ex-New Agers, pushing the return of the Nephilim narrative within Christianity, because it's of a New Age Gnostic mentality. The whole Christian Bible prophecy scene is rife with these ex-New Agers pushing a Gnostic view of the end times. Another guy who pushed this narrative heavily was the late Rob Skiba, one of the most influential figures within the Christian truther and end times Bible prophecy community. He wrote a book called Archon Invasion, The Rise, Fall, and Return of the Nephilim. So he just blatantly used the Gnostic term Archon and linked it with the so-called return of the Nephilim. If this doesn't convince you that Rob Skiba and that whole Christian truther scene is led by the spirit of Antichrist, then nothing will. Skiba could not have been more obvious with his Gnosticism, just blatantly using the term Archon. It's no coincidence that Skiba put Archon and Return of the Nephilim in the same title. I think it's one of the biggest clues that the idea of a last days Return of the Nephilim is part of a Gnostic view of the end times. And just to be clear, the problem isn't believing that the Nephilim existed. The problem is making it part of your eschatology, part of your view of the end times. The Nephilim have nothing to do with the end times. And Skiba also pushed Flat Earth, yet another warning sign that Flat Earth is Gnostic false light deception. Flat Earthers keep kicking against the goads when I've tried to warn them about that, but the red flags keep piling up. There is not one Bible teacher who pushes Flat Earth who isn't also caught up in some other kind of Gnostic truther deception. And Skiba was also into the Hebrew Roots movement, just like Alexandra and Truth Unedited. And this is another endemic problem within the truther scene. Douglas Hamp is also another one that pushes Hebrew Roots. And interestingly, Skiba's profile picture was, and still is, a tipped-over bottle of red pills, as in taking the red pill and waking up to the Babylonian Matrix. The same pattern over and over. And this return of the Nephilim narrative is now starting to break out into the mainstream crowd. For example, Remnant Radio did a video a couple years ago with Gary Bates, who's a close friend of Joseph Jordan, and he talked about the Nephilim in the context of aliens, the implication being that the Nephilim are making a return through the UFO phenomenon that's on the rise. And then here's another one they did recently called The Sons of God and the Nephilim. But considering that Remnant Radio leans in the charismatic direction, their embracing of the Nephilim narrative is not entirely surprising. And they've been promoting guys like Michael Brown and Gary Bates and Michael Heiser for quite a while. What is a bit more surprising, though, and a bigger indication about the spread of this Antichrist spirit, is that the more cessationist Calvinist types are now starting to embrace it as well. For example, Joel Webbin of Right Response Ministries, he's part of Jeff Durbin and Doug Wilson's Calvinist Reconstructionist Christian Nationalist crew. He's been doing quite a few videos on the Nephilim lately, including a couple with the same guy who was on Remnant Radio. Here's an interesting one called Sizes of Biblical Giants and Where They Could Be Hiding Today, which is the exact kind of stuff that L.A. Marzulli and Skywatch TV and Prophecy Watchers have been producing for decades. Webbin's even talking about them from the pulpit, devoting entire sermons to the topic. Here's one, Biblical History of the Watchers, Nephilim, and the Giants. Another one, Watchers, Nephilim, Giants, and Disembodied Spirits. Another one, Nephilim, Giants, and Oath-Taking. And then another one, The Nephilim, Satan's Attempt to Cut Off the Messianic Line, which again is an idea that the late Chuck Missler heavily pushed. So clearly, Joel Webbin has become quite enamored with the topic lately. And what's especially interesting about these Reformed Calvinist types being so infatuated with the Nephilim and aliens is that John Calvin, who the Calvinist tradition is named after, completely rejected the angelic view of Genesis 6, saying that it was refuted by its own absurdity. So it's interesting that today's leading Calvinists are not only taking the polar opposite route that Calvin did and embracing the angelic view, but the full-blown Gnostic Enoch narrative that the Nephilim and the Giants are still relevant for today and are possibly making a return, which I think is part of the Calvinist movement's overall shift in a more charismatic direction, starting to embrace the idea of signs, wonders, and miracles. For example, here's Jeff Durbin from last year admitting that he's starting to sound like a charismatic.
And one of the things you pointed out, Brian, in one of your episodes, I forget which one it was, I think it was on the Watchers, and it was just in terms of how the Bible gives descriptions about demons essentially covering certain areas, in charge of certain areas, who are influencing the leaders and the government and the people in those areas. They have sort of like
this is a great point,
a strong domain, and they influence. And
stronghold, if you will.
It's a stronghold. It's a demonic stronghold. And boy, we sound charismatic right now, but I'm sorry.
Jezebel spirit.
But you do have also to contend with the fact that, yes, biblically speaking, you can provide a watertight defense that you have wicked, pagan, evil governments influenced by demons, by Satan himself. And so what kind of instruction is given to the government, what to say, what kind of influence is being given, what kind of deception is being propagated is my point. And you brought that out in the Watchers episode, Brian, which I thought was very helpful.
So quite a bit of discussion about aliens, demons, and the Nephilim these days. And that's no coincidence. It's part of the spread of the Great Awakening deception and the rise of a false kingdom of God movement that the Lord will use to judge and destroy the dwelling place of demons, Mystery Babylon. He also mentions UFOs and aliens, which ties right in with the alien deception that I've been talking about in my other documentary, the mainstreaming of UFOs and aliens, and the belief that there's some kind of demonic interdimensional beings, which is helping give rise to the false signs and wonders movement that will define the Great Tribulation, as Christ warns about in Matthew 24 and Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2. Jesus mentions false Christs and false prophets performing great signs and wonders, and Paul likewise speaks of false signs and wonders accompanying the coming of the lawless one. During the Great Tribulation, supernatural activity will be at an all-time high. And the rising interest of UFOs and aliens over the past few years is part of the escalation of supernatural activity that will define the Great Tribulation. And it's giving the false church, in particular, a demonic enemy to counter. For false Christs and prophets to perform great signs and wonders most effectively, they need a demonic enemy to fight. And that's what UFOs and aliens are providing. And whenever the Gospels and Acts talk about Jesus and the apostles performing signs and doing miracles, the casting out of demons is always mentioned, meaning it will also be part of the false signs and wonders of the Great Tribulation. And people always retort, Satan can't cast out Satan, but Jesus only said that because Satan casting out Satan would mean the end of his kingdom, because a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. But the Great Tribulation will be the final years of Satan's kingdom. So it's not contradictory to Scripture to suggest that false Christs and prophets will be casting out demons during the Great Tribulation. In fact, it'll be perhaps the greatest sign or indication that Satan's kingdom is about to fall. And as I talked about last time, even so-called cessationists like Jeff Durbin have been talking about aliens and UFOs lately, not to mention the Nephilim. And as Goodrick Clark corroborates, UFOs and aliens have always been a hot topic in conspiracy. Not just Christian trutherism, but the New Age as well. I mentioned last time that David Icke talks about the Nephilim in Genesis 6, and New Ager Dylan Monroe also includes the Nephilim on his deep state map. And the Nephilim is increasingly becoming a more popular topic.